Ladies and gentlemen, both here physically with us in the building and those watching on Zoom in the United States, in Canada, and the UK, and anywhere else, welcome to this special evening, a few days before we celebrate Purim. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow here at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center. We routinely have events in English, both in person and also webinars just on Zoom. Usually they're dealing more with issues around Israeli history, politics, the Jewish world, and our current matzav. But we wanted to do something a little different. Purim's coming. We want to prepare for it in a special way by bringing three fantastic educators to get us thinking about different ways that we might think about the story of Purim, the Megillah, Esther, and specifically how we might think of it in light of our day-to-day lives, our current concerns as Jews, as Israelis. Before I do, I do want to give a special thank you to Hila Maor, who's been doing shurut with me with us since September and has been helping me throughout the year in a really extraordinary way. And this event in particular was really her initiative, so I want to thank Hila really for that. Okay. What's going to happen is I'm going to invite our three educators, our three teachers, to give relatively short shiurim. As like all great Jewish educators, they're used to giving deep, serious insights into Torah, which can take a long time. But I specifically asked for shorter ones so we can get through all of them and then have time for questions. So that's their challenge for tonight. But let me introduce them first, and then we'll get to the actual shiurim. So we're going to hear first from Rabbi Baruch Felberman, who teaches in a number of seminarim throughout Israel. He has a BA in Biology and Information Science and MA in Jewish Education, and he has Smicha rabbinic ordination from Yeshiva University. He's taught and served in numerous post-high school educational positions. He's also a licensed tour guide and guides yeshivot and seminaries, birthright groups and families, and is a staff member at Jerusalem's Davidson Center and Kotel Tunnels. And he's going to be speaking to us today on patterns in time, the historical message of Purim. We will then be hearing from Rabanit Shani Taragin, who is the educational director for World Mizrahi and Rosh Beit Midrash for the Beit Midrash program in Machne Moshe, Pennsylvania. She's directed, taught, and continues to teach and lead Tanakh tours and coordinate programs in many seminaries and adult education programs in Israel and worldwide. She's on the advisory committee for the World Mizrahi Shalhelet program for Shlichin, and she lectures on topics of Tanakh, Jewish education, Jewish law, and women's health. And this evening she's going to be speaking about Esther and the Zionist plot, or Megillat Esther, Zionist message in disguise. And last but by no means least, Rabbi Gideon Sylvester, who is the British United Synagogue's Israel rabbi. He previously served as the rabbi at Rabanit United Synagogue in the UK, which he turned into Britain's fastest growing Orthodox community. He served as an advisor in the office of the Israeli Prime Minister, taught Jewish approaches to human rights to university students and rabbinical students. He contributes columns to various English-speaking newspapers, guides groups in Germany and Poland, and conducts weddings across Israel, including mine, I should add. A highlight, no doubt, of his illustrious career. He's also a Sachs scholar, and he will be speaking on Haman, Hamas, Hitler, and Amalek. Okay, we have some wonderful shiurim in store for you. Rabbi Baruch Felberman.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Thank you, Hila. Thank you, everybody, for allowing me to address you tonight. There are so many, as you can see, we already have 3 thoughts tonight on Purim. There's countless thoughts on every single chag that we have throughout our year. And so I've just chosen one facet that at least speaks to myself on a yearly basis. And in order for us what we're going to do is to take a look at a part of the tractate Megillah. You have it, anybody who has the sheets in front of you, you will, I will be reading in the Hebrew translate, but you also have it in the English. You can read through it as I'm translating. And look at this at this Gemara, and then from there we'll talk about a couple of the incidents that have taken place in our country. There'll be more time. I'd like to get into a little bit of American history, but that's for the next session. Okay, 20 minutes, right? Yeah. Okay, here we go. So if you take a look at, it's really fascinating. If you have some time on during the Chag this year, it's like coming out for 3 days for a lot of us, people in Yerushalayim. There's a lot of time available, and the Gemara in Megillah, Tractate Megillah, they give us about 5 pages in which they're giving an explanation to the Megillah itself. Fascinating read, and I wanted to pick up on one of the stories, and I know it's been a year since the last time we read the Megillah, so let's take a look at number 1 on your page over here. So what are we starting with? Which part of the story are we up to? So we're sort of a little bit at the end of the story, in which Haman is approached. It's in the middle of the night. Haman is approached Ahasuerus, and he wants to request permission to kill Mordechai. At this point, Ahasuerus says to Haman, what should I do for he who the king wants to give honor to? Haman thinking we're talking about he himself, because who else would the king want to give honor to other than he himself, Haman? But he's surprised when he hears he has to take Mordechai for a ride on the king's horse and on the king's clothing, give him the king's clothing to wear. Something that Haman described that he wished to have, but it turned on him. It's a theme of the Chag. And the king, Ahasuerus, tells Haman to take Mordechai for a ride. So we're going to pick up this story. That's what we have in the Megillah itself, but we're going to pick up the story here in the Masechet, in the Gemara. And again, if you're not comfortable with the Hebrew or familiar with the Hebrew, you can look at the English. So when Haman finds Mordechai, Mordechai is doing what? He's in the middle of teaching. Besides being the political leader of the Jewish people, he's also one of the leaders. He's going to be probably one of the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah when returning here to Eretz Yisrael. So the Talmidim are sitting around Mordechai, and he's teaching them a shiur. And he's explaining to them the laws of the Kmitza. What's the laws of the Kmitza? In the Beit HaMikdash, whenever somebody would be giving a offering, a meal offering, flour offering, after the dough, the flour and the oil had been mixed, so from that dough, they would take a certain amount of the dough and put that as a, they present that, place that on the Mizbech, on the altar. So Mordechai is talking about the laws of the Beit HaMikdash that have to deal with giving a korban from flour. And the question is, why exactly is he talking about this now? Reason being, what day is this happening? This is like a surprise when you get back looking at your Megillah this year. You'll notice that the main events are taking place in a very short period of time. From the time that Haman, it's only a number of weeks, from the time that Haman decides that he wants to kill out the Jews, and he takes he peeled pork, he takes the lots on what day it should be. The lots that he chooses are actually almost a year later. It's going to come out in Adar, in the 12th month of the year, but this is happening in the first month of the year. And Haman, there's going to be plenty of time for him to prepare his army and the Jews afterwards as well. But the events are taking place in Nisan. And when Haman says that he wants to get permission from the king to kill the Jews, Mordechai hears about it. And that's the beginning of the story when Mordechai comes in sackcloth in the king's palace. And the continuation of the story, he says to Esther, you got to get to work over here. The day that Haman is invited to the day that Haman is actually strung up on the gallows and he had prepared for Mordechai, that day is actually the second day of Pesach. That's Tet Zayin Nisan. And Haman's out of the picture by Tet Zayin Nisan, the first month of the Jewish calendar. And it's not going to be till we have 12 months later, 11 months later, that we're going to have the battle against our enemies. And that's going to be the Chag of Purim itself. But the beginning of the miracle is going to take place way before. And the significance of the second day of Pesach is that in the Beit HaMikdash, they used to give what's called the Korban Omer. What was that? We take from the new grains that had just grown during the winter and give part of those grains as a Korban, as a sacrifice in the Beit HaMikdash. Today, we start the mitzvah of Sfirat Omer on that very same day, Tet Zayin Nisan. And it's because that is what was happening, would have been happening in the Beit HaMikdash. That's why Mordechai is involved, that his shiur, his lecture of the day is about this topic. The question that we're going to have over here is, what's the significance of the fact that he's talking about, why do we have to say what topic? I even forgot how I entitled my topic for tonight. So, Paul, thank you for reminding me. But why do I have to know 2,000 years later what was the topic of the lecture that Mordechai was giving? There must be something significant about that Korban Omer, about the sacrifice of bringing a piece of the dough. So I have to understand what's the significance of that Korban. The rest of the story is fascinating. And again, if you have some time, by the way, you can find, being that this is taking place in real life on Tet Zion Nisan, if you look on the page Tet Zion, there's going to be page 16 in the tractate. That's where you'll find the story. Easy to remember. So what happens next? So when Mordechai sees, when he sees Haman coming to take Mordechai for a ride, Mordechai thinks that's the end of it. Mordechai's frightened. This evil person's coming to kill me. You should run. He says, Kinderlachs, students, run away, that you should not be killed along with him. He shot the Nisatek Mordechai, Mordechai starts to daven. Asa Haman v'Yosef le'kamayo v'orach, and Haman sits down and waits. Adesalik Mordechai le'tzlusa, till Mordechai is going to finish his tefillot, his davening, his prayer. Amalu b'mayaskitu. So he turns to the students. Anybody know Yiddish? He says to them, "Nu, Zugepis, say something. What are you learning in the class?" So they say to him, in the time that the Beis HaMikdash was around, a person who brought this type of dough offering would receive a pardon, kapara. So Amar Lahu, Haman says to them in a mocking fashion, he says, "Do you think that your little piece of dough on the altar of the Beis HaMikdash is going to be strong enough to push off the strength that I got from Achashverosh, that I paid 10,000 talents of silver to be able to have the right to kill you? And, you know, you're playing with dough and I'm playing with real life here. So, yeah, I got to take Mordechai for a ride, but it's curtains for the Jewish people." Afterwards, we see the story continues that Mordechai finishes his prayer. He turns to him and he says, "Rasha, you evil person, a slave that has monies. Who does the slave belong to, and who does the slave's money belong to? Obviously, the master." So I always thought he was talking about that Mordechai saying God owns everything. It seems that there are some discussion over here that Haman actually was a slave to Mordechai at some point. So Mordechai is saying to Haman, "You're my slave, your money's mine." Bottom line, Mordechai is saying to him, don't think that you got this taken care of. Just because you paid the monies in, you're not the one who controls the show. So in order for us to have an appreciation of what's going on over here, why is it important to mention this Korban Omer? Why is it that the miracle of Purim really starts on the second day of Passover, Pesach, Tetzai Nisan? For us to have that appreciation, I wanted us to step out of the pages of the Gemara and to travel here into Eretz Yisrael, a little bit of a discussion of what happens in our history. It's really every day of our history, but I wanted to start in 1967 because I think that's such a clear example. In 1967, I see a lot of people are very young over here, but I was around. I was young, but I was around. 1967, as we know, let's start a little bit before that. You know that in 1956, the Jewish people had taken, the state of Israel had taken over Sinai in the Sinai campaign. Some things don't change, but we were pushed out of Sinai, and with the promise that Sinai will remain demilitarized. Obviously, that did not take place, and I'm looking at the clock. From 64 to 67, we also have what's called the Battle of the Waters. We have problems with Syria up in the north. They try to divert the tributaries which leads into the northern Jordan River to the Kinneret. Tensions are high, and I think we all remember the famous line. I don't even want to mention his name, in the holy city of Jerusalem, but Nasser, the Gamal Abdel Nasser, says he's going to throw the Jews into the sea. Okay. June 5th, first of all, it's very beautiful that right before, in the beginning of June, we established a unified government. There's unity within the land. And there's a decision that basically we have 200 old Mirage planes that should have been in museums already by then. And the Egyptians have a good solid 400 MiGs, correct? MiG-21s, MiG-19s, top of the line Russian. They have anti-aircraft, the SAM missiles. The Jordanians and the Syrians have another 200 aircraft. Basically, it's for every plane we have, they have 3 of them. Tanks are outnumbered 4 to 1. The decision of the Jewish state is that if we let them begin this war, it's basically over for us. I think anybody here might recognize people from the previous generation. You ask them, where were you in the beginning of June 1967? And my Rabbi, Rav David Fuchs, used to tell me that he was busy making sandbags. When he told me he was busy, hard to say, but he was preparing burial shrouds. So they thought that it was curtains for the Jewish people. At 7:15 in the morning of June 5th, our small Air Force went off to Egypt. How many planes went? How many planes did we keep in the country to protect the country? 12. Right, 12. They weren't even Mirages, they were worse. yeah, crank them up. We sent all of our Air Force, all 200 of our planes down to Egypt. At 7:15, they took off. By 7:45, we had basically taken out a good portion of the Egyptian Air Force and destroyed most of their runways. We came back, which is even a greater miracle because we didn't have the element of surprise, but within a short bit, a couple of hours later, came for a second round. And by the time that was finished, we had taken out the majority of the Egyptian Air Force, destroyed all their runways. A few hours later, we took out the majority of the Syrian and Jordanian Air Force as well. Instead of saying it's the 6-day war, you could actually say it's the 6-hour war. Miraculous, right? But how did it all happen? So, very quickly, I just want to point out there's a wonderful sefer, a book that you could get online, written by somebody named Chagi Ben Artsin. Small pamphlets he has on the Independence War, he has the 6-day war on Hanukkah, in which in his introduction, he says, when we talk about our history, we have to include the miracles within it. So what happened on that eventful morning? When we took off at 7:15 in the morning, we made sure to fly only 20 meters above the Mediterranean so that we wouldn't be detected by the radar. So that's great for the Egyptian radar, but we have a neighbor on our side over here, Jordanians. And when planes take off, they take off by going above 20 meters. And all of a sudden, they saw all these little blips on their radar screens, and they realized that we're doing this attack on Egypt. So they started sending to Egypt right away. It was in Arabic. The way to say anavim, grapes in Arabic, is like anab or something like that. Anab? How's your Arabic today? So anab. And they're sending it anab, anab, and the Egyptians are getting this message from the Jordanians. The Egyptians at some point said, what are they talking about? This is gobbledygook. At some point, they even shut off the communications because it was ridiculous. It took them a while, the Egyptians, to realize that because the Jordanian and Egyptian armies had been synced together, the Jordanians had put their army under the control of the Egyptians. They didn't realize, they had planned previously that on the night, at midnight of June 5th, 7 hours before the Israeli Air Force took off, that they're going to change the codes. And the Egyptian army did change their codes, and the Jordanians forgot to do so. So they were just sending nothing. And it took a long time for the Egyptians to say, oh, wait a second, maybe they didn't change the codes, maybe they're on the old codes. When they finally figured it out, it was too late. Our planes were already over Egypt. Okay, nice coincidence, it happens. And what else? Well, they had their anti-aircraft missiles. Yes, but at 7 o'clock in the morning, the defense minister of Egypt, the one with the prime minister of Iraq, was also in on destroying the Jewish people and tossing them into the sea. They were up in a plane going from Cairo to the border of Israel on the Sinai, and the defense minister had stated that he does not want any air activity during that hour from 7 to 8, and unless you get direct orders from him. As our planes came across the border into Egypt about 7:30, So where were these guys who were manning the missiles? Well, they had just been told they can't do anything from 7 to 8. They were busy eating breakfast. And therefore, you even had some officers that we have to do something about it. And there's other officers that said, but we got a direct order. They were fighting to move. So nothing happened there. And then lastly, what's amazing is that the Egyptians had a thought that the Jews might, that the Israelis might pull this off. So they had every half an hour a squadron of MiGs that would ride up the coast to check if they could see with their eyes the Jewish people coming in 20 meters above the sea. The only thing is that the 730 squadron, for some reason, we're talking about the Air Force, these guys are fighters. 730 squadron was a little bit late in getting up there in the air. Why? Because the head of the Air Force the night before had decided that he, the general, because he was so excited about the eventual war that was going to break out any moment, that they'd throw the Jews into the sea. So he threw a party the night before for all of his pilots. I don't know what they do. They're not allowed to drink alcohol, but they definitely had the dancers over there. And this guy went to sleep late, got up late, and he was ready to take off about 15, 20 minutes late. But it was too late because our planes were already over Egypt. How did that happen? In other words, you can take a look at something like this. It depends what kind of glasses you want to put on. It could all just be coincidences, one after the other. But the way we usually look at things, especially us here in Israel, we put on glasses that we see divine intervention. And you have that the defense minister puts out an order. You have that the missiles are not going to be shot. You have down that the radar people forgot to change their codes. You have down the squadron leaders late. All these things come together to allow us to be able to enter into Egypt undetected and not stopped in any way, and to be able to end the war in a few hours. It's like, as my son said, I had one of my sons on the way home from synagogue, from Beit Knesset, when he was in first grade, he says to me, Abba, it's a good thing that God plays on our team. He's right. From the mouth of babes. That pretty much sets it up. So it depends how you look at things, right? And we're used to looking at, this is not even, religious view on things. I think that Ben Gurion himself has a famous quote, right? If you're in Israel, if you're a realist, you believe in miracles. Because that's the history of the Jewish people. Yeah, we have our ups and downs. But we always see that, you don't always see it. God likes to run things based upon normal occurrences. But definitely, sometimes we get to see what's cooking around behind the scenes. And this is one of those cases when you have these coincidences all come together to ensure for us that we do have victory. That the eternal people who have that eternal relationship with God are successful and are victorious. I think all of us here, ask any of us, I know we're dealing with a lot the last year, challenges. If you ask any of us 2 years ago, we would say, yeah, what are we going to do with those 150,000 missiles that are pointed at us from Lebanon? Then all of a sudden, I don't know, we have these beepers and we get the top guy and nothing, no 150. When God wants to make sure that the Jewish people are safe, he's got our back. And this could go on, like I don't have, unfortunately, time, I'm running out. However, I think a lot of us are all in over here. Is that safe to say? I think we've grown up with the story of Eddie Jacobson being a good buddy of Harry Truman for years, for decades. And when Truman is vacillating, if he's going to actually decide on giving the Jewish people voting for the partition plan, it's Eddie Jacobson who comes in from Kansas City, knocks on the door of the White House and says, Harry, you have a hero, Teddy Roosevelt. You got to meet my hero. Guy's name is Weitzman, Chaim Weitzman. I mean, we don't know what the conversation was exactly, but we do know that Truman stood fast to the point that Truman didn't even believe that his emissaries in the UN would vote the way that the president of the United States was telling them to vote. There was such an antagonism about voting for the states, for the partition plan. Truman had to send his own emissaries up there. How many years did Truman and Jacobson know each other? Decades. They served in World War I together. But God sets it up beforehand. What do we say, the refuah before the makkah? Well, God usually puts things in place before we need it. And it seems that friendship grew decades before between Truman and Jacobson, way before we needed Jacobson to knock on the doors of the White House. How many years was Esther Hamalka in the palace of the king? I think I lost track of it, right? 5, 7, I got 8. So 5?
7 to 12.
7 to 12, okay.
Meaning from year 7 to year 12.
So year 12, so 5 years, she's the queen.
Yeah.
She's a nice, good Jewish girl stuck in the palace that she doesn't know why she's there. We don't know why she's there, and go figure out. But after the fact, we do realize it. So did God split the sea? Does he stop the sun and the moon like he does for Yoshua? No, because he doesn't break the laws of nature. Does God set things up to ensure that he has divine intervention in the path of history? Happens over and over again. 1948, battle in Sfat. We can keep going. But I do want to, my time is up. But what I do want to say is that to me, it might be straight up, right? But the fact that God has our back, always has our back. When I come into Purim, that's the message that Purim is giving to me. So what does this have to do with that korban omen, that little piece of dough? So most of the time you ask a person, why is it, and this would be number 2 on your page, you can look at it later, but why is it that we do give this little piece of dough? The first part, it gives us permission to partake of in the new crops. So we often think of Purim, before we start to fresh out, let us say to God, thank you, God, for a new crop. And that's what the Sefer HaChinuch mentions in number 2 on your page. But there's a very beautiful Yalkut Shimoni that the Maharal Miprag talks about, which he says that it's number 3 on your page, Omar Rav Yanai, okay. Omar Rav Yanai, B'noik Shebolam Adam Lokeach Lo Liter Echad Shel Basar. The way things work is you take like a pound of meat, and then how much you got to make sure until that stuff really comes out. Everyone could share their cholent recipes after the lecture. And then what happens? You seed the fields, and then you go to sleep a briot. In the second line, you're shnimal mitoseim. You go to sleep in your beds, and for the next few months, you're not doing much of anything. HaKadosh Baruch Hu me'shiv ruchot u'maleh ananim. He brings the winds, brings the cloud control. He brings down the rains. Mafriach tlalim, magadel tzmachim. He does everything necessary that a few months later, all of a sudden, we see that growth out in the fields. If you want to talk about partaking in the new grains, it's not just saying thank you. It's a recognition that a lot of things in this world runs because God is working behind the scenes to do it. And that's exactly the lesson of Purim. So when I am able to stand up and say, be part of our wondrous people and know that we're the eternal people with an eternal bond with God, and I know that God has our back, that's something you could be pretty happy about. That's something that I think we could all, I'll drink to that as well. So when you come to Purim, it's something to drink about. We should all have a very happy Purim and a Purim Sameach.
Thank you, Rabbi Felberman, and thank you, Paul and Milan, the entire Begin Center, and all of you for coming here this evening to hear 3 different perspectives on Megillat Esther. And I'm even going to begin with my disclaimer of my hoarse voice, but I feel almost the voice of Esther, and you'll see and hopefully hear a little bit of the enthusiasm and some of the messages that I personally, and I hope that each and every one of you also, Olim, or definitely coming from Anglo-based communities, can certainly relate to. And that is a little bit of the message in disguise in Megillat Esther, albeit we just heard of God almost being disguised through circumstance and coincidence in Megillat Esther. But we're going to take a look at other messages that are clearly disguised and written with a very particular methodology. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the satirical methodology. And we'll see how this is employed in the very beginning, noting as you look at your source sheets, in Megillat Daf Zayin, we find that Chazal, our sages, are very, very hesitant, very reluctant to canonize this Sefer. And there are many reasons why not to include Megillat Esther amongst or as part of the biblical canon. Not only is the name of God absent, not only is this story celebrating a victory in the diaspora, not only, if we think about it, is this a story of a heroine who intermarries, and especially during this time period, that's unheard of, certainly anathema for the Jewish people. And what type of message is this for all the young Jewish maidens? Yes, if you marry into politics, then you can help save the Jewish people. You have to be careful about that space. And certainly, with regard to the plot itself, there seems to be so much superfluous, not only material, but characters, tertiary characters, so many runics and tunics that seem to be kind of really unnecessary for our story. And yet, if we take a look at the story of Megillat Esther, not only within its canonical context, within a Sifrei Tanakh, but in its historical context, then more messages are going to be extrapolated. And it's almost as if the authors, from the very onset, are pointing out, please make sure that you understand the historical background. After all, how does Megillat Esther begin? Vayhi bimei Achashverosh, even with the Tamei HaMikra. Beautiful, right? We hear this twice. Vayhi bimei Achashverosh. That in itself should startle us, keeping in mind that almost every other sefer in Tanakh has a similar historical exposition. The book of Ruth, Vayhi bimei Shvot HaShoftim, in the time of the judging of the judges, or introducing almost every prophet in Jewish history. Vayhi bimei Uziyahu, Yotam, Achaz, Chizkiah. Notice that in every story of Tanakh, the exposition begins with the historical, not only context of Am Yisrael, but the background of the Jewish people, either in the Jewish land or even in the context of a Jewish monarch. Even Yechezkel, Ezekiel the prophet, as he's prophesying in Babylonia, begins his nevuah in the 30th year or in the 5th year of the king Yehoiachin, the Jewish king who was exiled. This is the only sefer, the only book in all of Tanakh where we find the non-Jewish king as the focus, so much so that even when we hear about Ezra, Nehemiah returning, of course, they'll talk about the Persian kings, but the focus is going to be what's going on with the Jewish people in the land of Israel. And therefore, Mordechai and Esther are telling us, okay, please remember everyone, that right now our monarch is Achashverosh. And yes, that should surprise you. Who? Achashverosh. This is the Persian king. We are living under a Persian monarchy. That's as if I ask everyone here, okay, whose political mandate are we living under now? And how many of you would say Netanyahu, without any political, again, whisperings or murmurings? How many of you would say President Trump, right? Basically, and the idea of saying we are living under this monarch is already telling the Jewish people, do you realize what's awry? Something is very strange over here. And therefore, it's imperative that we understand who is this Achashverosh. So before you see a timeline, but first we're even going to skip to the historical timeline that Chazal offer us, which is generally a minimalistic timeline, basically trying to figure out only from the sources that we have in Tanakh itself, where Achashverosh is amongst the other Persian kings. So we know of a Persian king, Koresh, Cyrus, who in 538 BCE allows for the Jews and all those who were exiled by the Babylonians to return to their land, reestablish autonomy, build the Beit HaMikdash. That's Cyrus. Next we know of another Persian king named Darius, and we know that he allows for the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash. Next we open up not only Megillat Esther, but Sefer Ezra, and we hear that Ezra comes back in the 7th year of Artaxerxes, who ruled after a king named Achashverosh. So it seems as if we have 4 Persian kings. Little technical problem. Now Chazal explained that Alexander the Great is going to defeat a Persian king named Darius. So Darius must be last. But wait a second, Darius allows for the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash, but Ezra comes back in the 7th year of Artaxerxes, and there's already a Beit HaMikdash. So it must be that Artaxerxes is Darius, and that means that how many Persian kings do we really have? Koresh, Achashverosh, and then Artaxerxes Darius, which means that the story of Purim happens after Jews are allowed to return to Eretz Yisrael, but before they have the Beit HaMikdash. But wait a second, that means that Jews are living under about a Persian regime after they have a Jewish state, after there's already an edict allowing Jews to return and reestablish autonomy in the land of Israel and fulfill prophecies of hundreds of years earlier? Can anyone imagine a reality where Jews are allowed to return to the Jewish state? A majority of the Jewish population would not take advantage and would stay in the diaspora, unheard of. And this is one reading. However, as we know, Chazal tell us, wait a second, there's another possibility, because after all, the Second Temple, as we know, which was built in 516 BCE and not destroyed until 70 BCE, wait a second, that means that it stood for 586 years, but according to Chazal's calculation, it only stood for 420 years. That means we have 166 missing years somewhere in Persian history. And here we have to give credit to all the British for going in pre-Ayatollah Khomeini and basically recognizing that the Persians, who were horrific historians, and actually had a series of 11 Persian kings. And if we look at the series in front of us, we find that after Koresh, there was another king, Cambyses, and then after him, there was a king named Darius, who allowed for the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash and established satraps and satrapies in Judea under Judean governorship. And only then was a king named Xerxes, who interestingly sounds a lot like his Persian name, Chishvirish. What do you know? Whom Herodotus says of him as well, that he had an extreme lust for wine and women. Also sounds a little familiar. Had a treasurer in his cabinet named Marduk. Also sounds familiar. And sure enough, of whom Ezra says in his time period, there was a horrific decree of genocide against the Jews. It seems that Ahasuerus then lives not before Darius will ask for the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash, of the temple, but actually after. That means that when you stop people on the street and you ask them, I'm so sorry, but where do the Jewish people belong? What do about 90+% of the Jewish people say? Where do the Jewish people belong? Not Uganda, but the land of Israel. And then you ask them, so excuse me, but why are you still in Chutz La'aretz? You name the city, New York, Teaneck, LA, and you can go through again, London and Montreal, wherever it may be. And they'll say, don't worry, we're waiting for Mashiach. We're waiting for Mashiach. As soon as the Beit HaMikdash is here, don't worry. Again, then we're going to come. And that's when I love to turn to them and say, that's the worst time to come, because not only will real estate prices be and even higher, if you can imagine, than they are now, they will skyrocket. But El Al prices that you think are ridiculous, good luck affording them. And if you think the Mamila and the Orient, no, sorry, again, you won't be able to stay here for so long. So now's the time. And then I think to myself, oh my, can I even imagine a reality where Jews will stay in Chutz La'aretz even after the building of the Beit HaMikdash? But then we turn back to Megillat Esther, and we see that there were Jews, only 42,360 Jews returned under Koresh, and during the time of Ahasuerus, there already is a temple. And then we have our Artaxerxes, and yes, it's true that the last of the Persian kings is Darius, but not Darius the first, but rather Darius the third. Now we understand a little bit of the emphasis of the authors here. Ahasuerus. Who Ahasuerus? Do you realize, Jews, that you're living under a foreign regime, that you have an opportunity to return to the lands of your heritage, that you have an opportunity to have your own Knesset, that you could be a self-governing people, and instead you're choosing to stay under Ahasuerus? Who Ahasuerus? Hamolech mehodu biad kush. And yes, it's true that on one hand, he's a very powerful king. And you'll see that the Megillah is framed with his power. He has power to rule over you, which also means that he can declare genocide against you at any moment. And even though he does it by the end, in the 10th chapter, what does he have the power to do? To tax you as heavily as he'd like. So just remember that you're living in this rule. Keshevet hamelech Achashverosh al kisei malchuto, asher b'Shushan habira. And albeit we know that there are many capital cities that are mentioned in Tanakh, Damascus is the capital of Aram, Tachpanachis is the capital of Mitzrayim, the only capital city in all of Tanakh, other than Yerushalayim, that is called Habira, is here, Shushan Habira, the elevated city. What are Mordechai and Esther saying? In a very sardonic manner, they're saying, shame on you. Why are you in Shushan Habira when you should be in Yerushalayim Habira? Why are you in Teaneck Ir HaKodesh? Or as the Meshech Chachma said, Berlin is Yerushalayim. No, it's not. Yerushalayim is Habira. This is the most elevated city. And as we continue, we see all the more the satirical approach as they share with us a party of 180 days that Achashverosh conducted in his third year because he had just won a surprise attack of the Greek armada against him, and he basically defended in the war of Salamis and Qutama. He was able to defend the Persians, but now it's time for 180-day Pentagon parties. Again, he'll call in the generals, they'll strategize during the day, they'll party at night for 180 days. That's a half a year. And what does he do during this time? Baroto, et osher kavod machuto, ve'et yikar teferet gedulato, for 180 days. Wait a moment, there's only one other place in all of Tanakh where these two words are juxtaposed, kavod and tiferet, and you have no excuse because we just read this 2 days ago. And which parsha is this? It's always read other than the leap year on Parshat Zachor, the Shabbat before Purim, describing the big day Kuhuna. Do you remember the garments of the priests? And lichavod u'litiferet, mentioned 3 times over. Lichavod u'litiferet, for glory and for honor. And basically, what are the authors telling us? I don't believe it. Why are you looking at the majesty of the king? And Chazal will go so far as to say it must be that he donned the priestly garments because you're looking at his Prada as if it's the beautiful garments of the Kohen Gadol. But you know what? You could go back to Yerushalayim and see the true kavod and tiferet. What are you doing at this party? You know, it's even terrible. After 180 days, which is always a half a year, and we see that the Persians celebrated the new agricultural year of Nisan, which means that 6 months later, they're going to celebrate a 7-day party. Yemei HaMiluim, they're called. Wait a second. I know Yemei Miluim. I know a 7-day party that's celebrated B'chatzar, Ginat, Bitan, Hamelech. Described exactly, and you can go to the Bible Lands Museum and see how the palace of Achashverosh in Shushan is modeled exactly after Shlomo HaMelech's Beit HaMikdash, with an outer courtyard, an inner courtyard, the Kodesh Kodashim, the Holy of Holies. What are you doing celebrating Shabbat Yemei HaMiluim, a 7-day party in the courtyard of the king's palace, when you could be celebrating a 7-day party, whether it's a reference to Sukkot, whether it's a reference to the inaugural 7-day party of King Solomon upon the completion of the first temple, or whether maybe they started in Tishrei and they ended in Nisan. I know of another 7-day party in Nisan, namely Karban Pesach and Chag HaMatzot. I know of the 7-day Miluim that they celebrated upon the consecration of the Mishkan that we're reading about in these parshiot. So again, Mordechai and Esther are turning to their population in the diaspora, saying, why are you celebrating a 7-day party looking at the king as if he's your Kohen Gadol, and celebrating in the courtyard of his palace, instead of celebrating a 7-day party in the courtyard of Kadosh Baruch Hu with the Kohen Gadol and the Kohanim, with the Kavod and Tiferet, celebrating literally the rebuilding of the second Beit HaMikdash. And some of you are wondering, is this really their message? And the answer we're going to see, and hopefully you'll be convinced within the next 12 and a half minutes, is in fact, yes. And now because in their very sardonic tone, they are trying to deliver what we call a satire. I remember the first satire that I was exposed to in 7th grade it was called Strange Bedfellows. It was about a donkey and an elephant who didn't get along with their red toothbrush and their blue toothbrush, and you could read it perfectly fine. But if you understood the American politics a little, or if you understood Russian communism, you would appreciate Animal Farm so much more. And that's exactly Mordechai and Esther are telling us. Please read this within historical context. Reminds me also of one Shabbat. My husband and I were scholars in residence, and a certain young Israel, I won't mention which one. And we came there early, and I was picking up Shemos off the floor and putting it aside from Sidurim and Chumashim. And then I picked up a piece of paper. It said the 10 commandments of this synagogue. Commandment number 1, as you enter, doctors, you sit in the first 15 rows of the synagogue. Lawyers, you sit in the next 15 rows. High-tech professionals, the next 15 rows. On and on. Educators weren't even in that list. But they said, in order to maximize conversation during Chazarat Tashat, during the repetition of the Shmoneh Esrei. I'm thinking this is a very interesting shul that we were invited to. Commandment number 2, decibel levels must exceed 14 during the reading of the Torah. Getting a little nervous. By rule number 3, I finally understood, rule number 3 was addressed to the women. Women must come in with a flamboyant headwear to allow for sufficient gossip throughout the prayer service. And you can imagine the others as well. On the bottom it said, Purim Sameach from the Gabaim. And I was thinking to myself, oh my, I'm about to put this piece of paper together with selections of the Chumash and the Siddur. And in 2,000 years from now, Solomon Schechter's great-grandsons are going to uncover this Geniza. And they're going to say, what type of society was this? Was with strange commandments. And I can't believe also that they had prayer books in English. Again, what time period? And they wouldn't necessarily understand, which is why we're now going to take a look at the continuation of the satire. Not only do they talk about these 7 days, but then we hear Gam Vashti HaMalkah. We hear that in the culture, which is a drinking culture. This is a culture in which we find ourselves, all of the different garments, all the different mentions of the materials, reminiscence, obviously, of the materials of the Mishkan and the temple that we're supposed to realize. They're telling us your priorities are all wrong. But we also hear of Vashti's party, and we don't even hear of a good reason why she doesn't appear on the 7th day before her king. Isn't that her job? And doesn't she know her king well enough to know that her king is going to be very angry? And what does Memuchan suggest? That the king rightfully follows. You know what? If this queen doesn't obey you, then she should be banished. And a different queen should basically take her place. She should be the apple of your eye. And you know what? Letters should go out that state the obvious, apparently, which is Kol ish sorer bebeto umidaber kishon amo. That every man should be the master of his house, and you should speak the language of the husband. Please remind ourselves that this is pre-Betty Friedan. And every man was the master of his house. And the language was the husband's language. And therefore the question is, what's going on? Really, Mordechai and Esther, why are you telling us this? You could have told us in much simpler forms that now there's a vacancy for queenship. Why tell us this entire background? What they're telling us is, you know in Tanakh, that very often our relationship with God, we're going to read in just a few weeks from now, the Song of Songs. Our relationship is like a husband and a wife, a king and a queen. We are the queen of God. And after 7 days, God wants us to come before him so that he can show us off as a light unto the nations before all the other nations. And God said, I'm calling you. I'm calling you home. I'm calling you to come and appear before me. And what did the Jews of Persia say at the time? For no good reason, they said, no, we're not coming. And the king says, oh, okay, if that's the case, then I guess you're going to be banished from history, and I'll have to focus instead on someone else, meaning the Jewish population that's now in the land of Israel. And just to remind you that really every man should be the master in his own home. What are you doing as third-class citizens in Persia when you could be running for Knesset in Israel? What are you doing speaking? Fill in the language. Why are you speaking English and Yiddish and French and Chutz La'aretz when really next year we're going to have a English Yom Iyun get here in the Begin Center because everyone is going to understand Hebrew. That's okay. At least speak English in the lands of the Hebrews, in the lands of the language. And as such, appreciate even the primary text that we have. This is part of the satire. What are you doing? And therefore, the very next story is, oh yes, now you're going to see what happens. And albeit from the time that we're very young, we learn about this beauty contest of Esther. If you look very carefully, it's not a beauty contest at all. Rather, it's more like a concentration camp where young girls between ages 10 and 12 are taken away from their parents at the ocean flats, never to be seen, never to be heard from again. And most of them die in the harem, albeit they try to escape. And that's why they need a bodyguard. And this is where they're given only tamukin. They're given cosmetics, and they're in bond the same way that Jacob and Joseph were in Egypt, while they're literally starved. And it's only because Mordechai is keeping an eye on Esther, and he's able to slip a 200 shekel bill under the barbed wire fence. And Haggai will put some Hershey kisses in, as he not only gives manoteha with tamrukeha, he gives cosmetics, and Esther is the only one who receives a food portion. And as such, she's able to survive, and she's able to be chosen as the queen. And then, in the 7th year, when she's coronated as the queen, again, and we're wondering, this poor Jewish girl who has to hide her identity in an anti-Semitic culture, this is what happens, living and staying in the diaspora. Fast forward 5 years, and we hear that, yes, anti-Semitism, that I'm sure we'll hear is latent throughout the generations, comes, and now the people are meant to see what really are the results. And as we take a look, not only at the prophecies that you see on pages 4, 3, and 4, that really should have been fulfilled, we hear of, and these decrees, and we hear of, and the fact that they're celebrating the takana, the foundation of drinking, instead of celebrating the foundation of building the Beit HaMikdash. And we hear about an Ish Yehudi, Hayav Shushan HaBirah, the only other time in Tanakh that Ish Yehudi is mentioned is by the Nabi Zachariah, who is living in Yerushalayim during this time, telling them that an Ish Yehudi should be in Yerushalayim, so that the Goyim, so that the non-Jews can hold on to their coattails, saying, take me to the Beit HaMikdash. And therefore Mordechai and Esther say, instead of the Ish Yehudi living in Yerushalayim and encouraging the non-Jews to come to the temple, we have an Ish Yehudi instead, who's going to be persecuted, as we know, in Chutz La'aretz. And his name is Mordechai, and Esther, albeit she has the Jewish name Hadassah, is Esther, Ashtart. That's what happens when you're living in the diaspora. You become assimilated with non-Jewish names. And therefore, we hear about the terrible anti-Semitism and the very easy way that Haman convinces Achashverosh to annihilate the Jewish people. And how is that? He says it's very simple. Yeshno am echad mufuzar u'meforad bein ha'amim. He doesn't even call them Jewish. Achashverosh never even hears that these are the Jewish people that Haman is referring to. He says there are people who are dispersed amongst all the nations of the land. In other words, no one's even going to know if they go missing, because there are a couple of 100,000 here and maybe 500,000 over here. Can you imagine if we were all unified as a people in a state? Then we would be on the front page of the New York Times every day, for better or for worse. But ultimately, and Amachan Mufuzar Mufurad Bein Hamim, the Datehem Shonot, and they have these strange cultures and customs, but don't worry, but they don't really take their culture so seriously. They don't really observe so much anymore. So no one's really going to care. It's not as if their culture contributes so much to society, so you may as well get rid of them, because they're distributed everywhere. They're diversified. They're polarized. We live in a vociferous society. And Achashverosh is convinced. And we'll skip now, just for the sake of time, all of the stages of Esther literally waking up from her passivity, from her slumber to activity, to having a voice, to Mordechai imploring of her, don't you realize that we all have these moments? We all have these moments in our lives where we can decide we're going to be passive spectators of Jewish history, or if we're going to be the active authors of Jewish history. And it's only through Esther and the Mordechai's attempts that we're able, in fact, to thwart the genocidal threat and ultimately kill and stop for that time the anti-Semitism and the threat of immediate annihilation. But if we look carefully, as Rabbi Felberman said, it's really a very short-lived story. The letters go out for Jewish genocide on Yud Gimel Nisan, and already 70 days later, on Chav Gimel Sivan, in Perek Chet, we hear that 70 days later, they're already allowed to defend themselves, and by then, everyone is in awe of Mordechai. He's in charge of Haman's SS office, and as such, there's fear amongst everyone. No one's going to initiate killing the Jews other than the true anti-Semites. And 70 days, we know of this theme in Tanakh, a theme of years parallel to days, whether it's the Navi Ezekiel, who has to lie on his sides for 430 days, parallel to 430 years of iniquity, or whether it's the Jewish people who have to wander in the wilderness for 40 years to compensate for 40 days of the tales of the spies. 70 days, not by chance. God is telling us, you didn't get the message of 70 years of exile? What should have happened? As soon as they had an opportunity to return to the land, to reestablish autonomy, to rebuild the temple, we should have gone back. And then we would have successfully rebuilt. You didn't learn the message. So then I'm putting you through a microcosmic galut of 70 days. And hopefully now you'll learn the message. What's so sad though, is that we look at the ends of Megillat Esther and we ask ourselves, so did they learn the message? Did they get up afterwards and fill out their nefesh b'nefesh applications? Well, let's take a look. We see that they accepted on their own to celebrate and to remember these days and to remember the poor. And then they decided, kimu v'kiblu, which means they accepted something upon themselves. Chazal say, Torah shebachtat, Torah shebal peh, the oral law, they re-accepted the Torah. But basically they accepted, we're going to change. Yes, we're going to return to the land of Israel. We'll start that application and bring in all of the documentation. But then by the end of the pasuk, what does it say? Al Zaram. So you know what? Sorry, we have elderly parents. We have a good job. And no, it's a little hard. You know what we'll do though? We'll send our kids to Bnei Akiva camps. We'll send our children. Our children will make Aliyah. But 2 verses later we hear, V'zachram lo yasuf mizaram. For the children it also, this whole story just became a memory. I wonder even now, how are our children and grandchildren going to remember October 7th? How are they going to remember the events of today? Well, I'll tell you that Mordechai and Esther were very disappointed. So Esther writes, volume 2 or version 2 of Megillat Esther, she realizes people forgot the message. She sends it out again a few years later, but she adds an addendum, a very strange addendum. All it says is she adds, Divrei Shalom ve'emet, words of peace and truth. What does that mean, words of peace and truth? Anyone who's living during that time know that she's making a reference directly to the prophecy of Zechariah, source number 13. Zechariah, prophet in Eretz Yisrael, and literally just a few years before Esther HaMalkah, talks to a mission, literally emissaries from Babylonia, who come in the 4th year out of 6 years of the rebuilding of the Second Temple. And they asked Zechariah, they said, well, now that there is a Second Temple, do we still have to fast in the 5th month? Do we still have to fast on Tisha B'Av? In other words, is this temple going to last? And Zechariah responds unequivocally. And he says, you know, it's not about fasting. You know, God hasn't been fasting. It's not up to, again, God, whether or not the temple is going to last. It's up to you. And it's up to you, the Jews in Chutz La'aretz. Are you going to come here and build a society unlike that of your ancestors? A society built on the values of peace and truth, where you don't think badly one of the other, where you listen to all sides of the political and religious spectrum, where you have basic values of justice, where you take care of the indigents in society. Because if you do that, then I guarantee, not only will this temple last, but all the fast days of the destruction, the fast of the 4th and the 5th and the 7th and the 10th, they'll all turn into days of celebration, but it's up to you. If you pursue truth and peace. And therefore Esther says, come on, you will know this prophecy. Come on. And how could you forget? How could you forget the message, the satirical message of the story, which is get up and build such a society? What happens? It says that they heard this and they started celebrating again. They started fasting. They accepted the fast. In other words, if they would have come to Eretz Yisrael, they would have had a temple and they wouldn't have had fasts anymore. Instead, they decide, no, let's stay in Chutz La'aretz and we'll keep fasting. And what a depressing end we have. So depressing that we hear that they agreed to stay. And Mordechai, literally the Bnei Akiva Shaliach, besides, if he didn't have an effect on this generation, he'll stay, maybe he'll have an effect on the next generation. And I'd like to finally end with why did they write this in a satirical fashion? Why not just say, as so many prophets do, make Aliyah, and come here to the land of Israel. Recognize that if you stay in Chutz La'aretz, it's just a matter of time where you're going to see the latent anti-Semitism erupting. Come here, where you can fight, where you can defend yourselves. I have a student, literally was attacked in the University of Pennsylvania. He handed in the next day his resignation to his prestigious scholarship, got on a plane, and is now fighting in the IDF. And why is that the minority? I agree. Why is that the minority? Mordechai and Esther say, don't you understand the dangers? So why write this in a satirical fashion? I guarantee that they also gave sermons in synagogue. I guarantee that they also opened up the works of the 48 prophets and the 7 prophetesses. So much so that our sages tell us that it was the removal of the ring from Achashverosh to Haman that had a greater effect than any of the words of the prophets in Tanakh. And sometimes we have to laugh at ourselves, just like Rabbi Yehuda Levi says to the king of Khuzar, when the king of Khuzar says, I don't understand. You believe so much in the centrality of the land of Israel. What are you doing here in Spain? And he says, you're right, I'm wrong. That every time we say that we aspire to return to Zion, he says we really just sound like chirping birds. Maybe it's time that as we read Megillat Esther, that we can laugh at ourselves. But the truth is that I feel that I'm preaching to the choir because I always say that I'm not sure how Jews in the diaspora can read the story and can celebrate Purim. Maybe it's our responsibility here to give them a phone call this year. Maybe in the never-ending Purim this year, when for the last time, for the next 20 years, all of the Jewish people throughout the world are going to be unified as we all will read the Megillah this Thursday night and Friday. Maybe now is the time to remind everyone, Jews all over the world, that this is the time. Ha'im le'ed kazot higat lamachut. May we here in Eretz Yisrael be able to celebrate.
Good evening. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for those fantastic talks. My head is like buzzing with what I just heard and learned, so it's hard to focus on what I was going to say. When Paul kindly invited me, or should I use this? Kindly invited me to speak this evening. The invitation said, speak about what's on your mind this Purim. And what was and has been and is very much on my mind, and I'm sure on your minds as well, has been the war. I think it was around the time when we heard about the Bibas family and what had happened to the children. And I was kind of confronting, or not even able to confront, the depths of evil that we were seeing unfolding in front of us. So I wanted to think a little bit about the issue of Amalek. I think for most of my life, I always held back from talking about Amalek because it always seemed so strong and so ultimate evil. And yet it felt like ultimate evil was unfolding in front of us. So what we're going to do for the next 15, 20 minutes or so, or hours, this needs to be the person, is to, is to take a look at the issue of to what extent we can relate the idea of Amalek, the tribe that attacked the Jewish people as they came out of Egypt for no reason at all, the tribe that we're commanded to kill every man, woman, child, animal, everything about them, to eradicate. To what extent can we or should we not apply that to what we're seeing around us? And it is being applied. And in fact, I just received yesterday, I think, an email message from Ortar Sven, an organization in which I studied and which I work for, from Rabbi Kenneth Brander, who's kind of the new Rabbi Riskin. Well, he's a great man, but Rabbi Riskin's my teacher, so I can't quite say that. But he describes a visit to the north, to somewhere in the north of Israel, where he was visiting troops, and he was invited. Sorry, the print is very small. But he was invited by the commander of the troops to write a message on a missile that would be aimed at Hezbollah. And he thought for a minute about what he should write, and he says, and what's more appropriate than this eternal message to fulfill the mitzvah and mission of obliterating Amalek. So he sends a missile to Hezbollah, that's hit hard, and it says, in order to fulfill the mitzvah of destroying Amalek. So the question is, can we really apply? It's a very dramatic statement, because when you say Amalek, it means every single man, woman, child, animal. Can we apply that to the evil enemies that Israel is facing today? So what I want to do is and there you've got the mitzvah from the Torah in front of you. What I want to do is I want to look at a couple of historical examples where rabbis discussed among themselves whether they thought the enemies of Israel could be described as Amalek. It came up a bit in the ancient world. It came up, people say maybe there are hints of it in the Kuzari, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi talking about the Crusaders who came and very brutally attacked Jewish communities along the Rhineland. We're going to look at two more closer examples. But we're going to start with the Rambam's description of the mitzvah. And the Rambam does it here. He also spoke perfect English. So there he is in English as well, for those of you who prefer. And the Rambam essentially describes two sets of mitzvot. He describes a mitzvah to wipe out the 7 nations who lived in this land before Joshua came in and conquered it. And then in the following halacha, he describes a mitzvah to wipe out the tribe of Amalek. He separates them. First was the 7 nations, then there is the tribe of Amalek. And can anyone spot the difference? Remember those games that you have when you're a kid and you have 2 pictures and you have to spot the difference between them? There's one very significant difference between those 2 mitzvot. Can anyone spot it? Sorry? Okay, there's an issue of memory. There's something else that's very fundamental to our situation.
One says obliterate, the other one says remember.
Okay. Yes.
So
I'm
that's
looking for one
contradictory.
more difference.
Enmity.
Take a look at the last line of the first one. Ah, lovely. Thank you very much. What's your name? Zev. Thank you very much, Zev. Zev points out to us, as does a great rabbi called the Rabbaz, as does Rabbi Soloveitchik in a minute, the crucial difference in the way that the Rambam cites these 2 laws is that when he talks about the 7 nations, he says, but their memory's already wiped out. They're gone. Or as the rabbis put it in the Mishnah in Yadayim, Sennacherib has already spread them out so much that we haven't got a clue who they are. They've disappeared from sight and you can't possibly spot them. But when it comes to Amalek, the Rambam doesn't say that. With the inference that there may be some sort of trace of Amalek in the world. Maybe not an individual one, but certainly we're going to see Rav Soloveitchik talk about national characteristics. But first, let's come to the Sefer Chinuch, because the Sefer Chinuch, who describes all of the 613 commandments in the Torah and gives the rationale behind them, when he talks about the mitzvah of Amalek, you can see that he says at the end that this is a mitzvah. In English, I shortened it for you, so you just get the key bit. This is a mitzvah which applies to every single male Jew at all times. In other words, wiping out Amalek is not just a mitzvah for biblical times, it's a mitzvah for me now. So if a man walked into this room with a big banner saying, I am an Amalekite, then it would be my job to pull out the gun that I don't have and aim with the aiming ability that I don't have and eliminate him. So now let's come to the discussions of well, modern or yeah, I guess it's kind of early modern time. And the first big example that I wanted to show is the visit of Kaiser Wilhelm to Jerusalem. Remember, anyone who goes on a guided tour, you have a fabulous guide with us, they always point out to you by the Jaffa Gate how they broke up the walls of Jerusalem to allow him in. Kaiser Wilhelm was not a particularly nice bloke, to put it mildly. When he heard that lots of Jews were moving to Argentina, he said, "Oh, if only we could send them ours too." He was not very fond of us. He also described us as the parasites of my empire who were twisting and corrupting Germany. So he wasn't a great friend of the Jewish people, but one of his close friends was very inspired by the works of Theodor Herzl, and thought that Theodor Herzl was onto some interesting ideas. And even Kaiser Wilhelm gets onto this idea because he says the energy, creativity, and efficiency of the tribe of Shem, that's us, would be diverted to worthier goals than sucking dry the Christians. So he comes to this idea that maybe getting Jews to the land of Israel might be quite a good thing. It might also be a way of expanding German influence, which is something that he wants to do. And he agrees to meet with Theodor Herzl, and they meet earlier, and then they meet again in Jerusalem. When he comes to Jerusalem on the 29th of November, I think, 29th of October, sorry, 1898, Kaiser Wilhelm processes into Jerusalem. I think I have a picture of it. No, maybe not. Yes. Apparently the Jews built this kind of arch thing specially for him, so that he can process into Jerusalem. The chief rabbis of Jerusalem, the Ashkenaz one is Rabbi Salant, together with the Sephardi one, everyone's dressed up very fancifully, as is he, in his rather splendid uniform. They come out and they make a blessing over seeing a king. And they greet him with great honor. But Rabbi Sonnenfeld, who was one of the great rabbis of Jerusalem, who had lots of debates with Rav Kook, he says, I'm not going to greet this man. And the reason I'm not going to greet this man is because I have a tradition that he is a descendant, and his people are descendants of Amalek. And he refuses to make that journey. The discussion then takes off in a very big way around Nazism, and whether the Nazis are descendants of Amalek. Their evil is unspeakable. The depths of it are unbelievable. I guided in Poland, been there, guided there some 14 times. And in fact, I felt I only really understood what went on in Auschwitz when I heard the account of what was done to those Bibas children. Suddenly brought to me that depth of evil. So Rav Soloveitchik discusses in America whether the Nazis are themselves to be considered as Amalekites. And he says, I heard the answer from my father of blessed memory. Every nation that conspires to destroy the Jewish people is considered by the halakha to be Amalek. So Rav Soloveitchik doesn't think that there are necessarily, or he doesn't think that we can identify individual Amalekites in our days. But what he does say is that we can identify nations that take upon themselves the ideology of Amalek, the ideology that says we want to destroy every single Jew. And that's what Rav Soloveitchik says about Nazism. He says there's the idea of an individual Amalekite, which we might not be able to find, but the second obligation on the Jewish people is to go out to war against Amalek. Therefore, if any nation seeks to destroy us, we're commanded to go to war against them when they rise up against us. And that war is a milchemet hitzvah, a war that we have to, every single one of us, go out and fight. And Rav Soloveitchik continues actually with his idea that Germany, in some sense, represented Amalek in his discussions around the question of war reparations. There was, as many of you will know, it's nice to mention Begin in the Begin. It's nice to mention Begin at any time. We miss him, but especially in the Begin Center. As you know, there was a massive debate in Israel about whether to accept war reparations from Germany. Ben-Gurion felt it was a necessity. Begin thought it was a massive insult, inappropriate blood money, and he forcefully spoke about it, led what turned into almost a riot in the Knesset, which in those days was unprecedented. Over the issue of war reparations, he was against it. Rav Soloveitchik, very interestingly, initially, he took Menachem Begin's side, and he felt that since this was Amalek, we should not take their money, and because they're so evil, we shouldn't take their money, and it's blood money, and he was dead against it. In the same way as Mordechai is hesitant about taking Haman's property. But interestingly, Rav Soloveitchik had a change of mind. And later in life, in the book of Nefesh Harav, it says that he decided that perhaps he got it wrong. For a very interesting reason. He says sometimes there are some issues where we don't really know what the answer is, but God teaches it to us through history. He says Zionism is one of them. He says initially, when it came to Zionism, the rabbis were very divided over whether it was a good thing, and there were a lot of rabbis who were dead against it. My heroes were in favor, but there were lots who were against it. But he says, you know what? History's made the decision for us. God has taught us the lesson through history, and it turns out that the state of Israel is a very, very good thing for the Jewish people. He says the same was true about whether we should accept war reparations. He says, I thought it was the wrong thing to do, but actually, we really did need that money in order to build up the state of Israel. We took it, it was put to very good use, and it turns out that we should have had it, which shows a certain modesty of a rabbi. But sadly, there's this idea that in Nazism, we witnessed Amalek, and here's a memorial in The Hague, and at the bottom of The Hague, it quotes the psukim about Amalek. It's a memorial to the Jewish people murdered in the Holocaust, and it quotes the psukim about Amalek, because, as we've seen, this view that Amalek is there in Nazi Germany. In fact, not everyone agrees with the approach that Rav Soloveitchik stated. Rabbi Nachum Rabinowitz, who was Rosh Yeshiva in Ma'aleh Adumim, and most famously the teacher of my teacher, Rabbi Sachs, he was very uncomfortable with this use of the idea of Amalek in terms of Nazism. He said, it's true, I'm going to summarize it, but those of you who want to read it from the thing Canty said, or from the sheet, Rabinovich says, it's true that rabbis can speak that way when they're giving drashot. When you're giving a sermon in shul, there's a certain leeway, there's a certain poetic license. That's the way we do it. It's lots of fun when you're a rabbi. But, says Rabbi Rabinovich, that does not mean that it should be taken literally as a halachic statement. It's an interesting poetic formulation. It is not to be taken as halacha, and it's wrong to do so. Even though, he says, of course, Nazism was something desperately evil. And in fact, he quotes Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook. Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook, who is known, the son of the Rav Kook, is known as the arch-Zionist and the arch-defender of Israel, and in some ways a very strong figure. But what Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook said was that this was not an appropriate as a halachic statement. And in fact, Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook said, you cannot speak about Arabs in general as being Amalek. They have, interestingly, he felt, a legitimate argument with the Jewish people, legitimate possibly claims, not as good as ours, but things worth saying in the debate over whose land this is, and therefore they're not Amalek. And that matches what Rabbi Sachs says. Rabbi Sachs talks about the idea of when hate is rational, based on some fear or disapproval that, justified or not, has some logic to it, then it can be reasoned with and brought to an end. But unconditional, irrational hatred cannot be reasoned with. There is nothing one can do with it and end it. It persists. So Rabbi Sachs, interestingly, in that essay, goes through the history of Egypt, and he talks about how the Egyptians had possibly rational reasons for fearing a Jewish takeover in Egypt at the time of the Exodus. He says they weren't correct, but there was a rational basis to what they thought. Amalek is the enemy who is totally irrational in his hatred of the Jewish people and hates us for no reason. Rabbi Ronen Lubitz, who's the rabbi of Kibbutz Nir Etzion, which has a lovely hotel, and he was my teacher in part of our rabbinic training. I think he's probably a little older than he is in this photo. He's written a fascinating article about the history of how we look on Amalek, and he's also done some very interesting research into the writings of contemporary religious Zionist figures. And what he says, what he concludes, which I was kind of very relieved and happy to see, is he says it's true that religious Zionist rabbis will use their pulpits to give drashot condemning evil and use the word Amalek in terms of in a sermonic way, and sometimes when they're condemning a specific terrorist act. But he said it is unheard of, interestingly, in his experience, in all of his research, to find them giving halachic statements determining such and such a person or such and such a group as Amalek. He says you don't find it in their writings, which I thought was very, very fascinating. They're towing the line that Rabbi Rabinovich and Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook set, which is it's okay to speak about Amalek in a sermon kind of way, but it's not the way to speak in terms of halakha. We shouldn't think that we have a halakha to start wiping out men, women, and children of any group. And the truth is, whatever you think of that, it certainly also has a certain kind of practical implication, because when we do throw those words around, they can have dangerous consequences for the state of Israel, whatever we think of our enemies. So here you have an example where our Prime Minister used the word Amalek. I don't have the exact quote of this, so I want to be careful of what I say, but his words were certainly taken and understood as being a statement that the people of Gaza were related to Amalek, and therefore that we had a legitimate grounds to commit genocide there, and that ended up pulling him in front of the International Court of Justice. So we have to be a little careful of how we use those words. So I just wanted to end with 3 thoughts about how messages we can take from this. I'm sure I've got the 3. Yeah. And they are as follows. The first is that whatever words we band about, and we should always be careful of how we speak, we can thank God that, although there were some initial problems on October 7th, we have a wonderful, beloved army, which is highly trained and highly equipped to defend us. And I think we have to keep faith with our army, and they know what they're doing, and they're going to do it in the right way. The second thought is that it comes from Rav Simple Zissel Ziv, and I actually read it in this week's Torah Tidbits, but I thought it was so lovely. There's a question of how do you manage to, on the one hand, always remember Amalek, and also wipe out his memory simultaneously. That's the command of the Torah, and it's kind of a little bit of a paradox, at least for me. I find it hard to get my head around, but we know that we do it. We do it by, number 1, reading the Megillah, hearing the name Haman, and then making sure that we drown it out. That's a way of having those 2 things going on simultaneously. The second way that we do it is by eating oznei Haman, which is gorgeous. What a funny people. I love the Jews. How do we remember someone and wipe them out? By eating cakes. That's what the Jews do. We eat cakes. Why Haman Tashen? So one is this idea that that it comes from a tash in order to, which means to weaken, lachlish, and that's what we're trying to do to Haman. Another idea is that Haman Tashen are cakes which kind of covered, the inside of them is covered, and you hope it's chocolate, and you hope it's not poppy seeds, but you don't quite know till you open it up. It's a surprise. And that's a symbol of Purim, where things are covered up, and you don't quite know what's going on. But this rabbi said that what Amalek tries to do is to break our self-confidence as Jews. That's his goal. And what we have to do is be very confident about who we are. And I think, actually, in all the evil that I've seen, it's also given a boost to my self-confidence. Because if you're still stuck on English media or you watch them a bit, it can really break your confidence. If you watch Sky News or the BBC especially, they're constantly telling us that we're in the wrong. And they're constantly telling us that in some sense we're responsible for the fighting that happens and the deaths that happen and the destruction that happens. And what he says is that it's important at Purim to have self-confidence in our people, to know what we are and what we stand for. And the third thing he says, which I think is gorgeous, is that what we have to do is the way that we remember Haman and wipe him out is by having especially crunchy Haman Tashen, wasn't it, Haman? And he says you should crunch on them and grind them, and in that way you crunch and grind on Amalek. So please God, for all of us, I don't know how things are going to work out, but I think we have a wonderful army to defend us. I think we should stand proud and we should crunch Haman Tashen in our battle against Amalek.
Okay, I'm going to invite our three guests to the front. It's already 9 o'clock, but I want to give just let's have 10 minutes questions. If people have questions on what they've heard. If not, then I'll also be happy to ask our guests if they want to ask any questions of each other. But let's go to the audience first. Any questions on any of the three wonderful talks that we heard on the presence of God in Jewish history, on Zionism in Megillat Esther, and on Amalek and its connotations? Any thoughts, questions? So yes.
I'd like to ask this question, whoever wants to answer it. A couple weeks ago, about 400,000 Hezbollah members and supporters were at the funeral of their perfect man, Hassan Nasrallah. Should Israel have destroyed the attendance there?
Okay, so for those who didn't hear, especially on Zoom, maybe the question was whether Israel should have taken advantage of the gathering of Hezbollah supporters at the funeral of Hassan Nasrallah to Amalek-like wipe them out in that gathering. You can use the microphones, just make sure that. Yeah.
I think it's an excellent question that many of us were thinking on that day. And I myself was thinking that, wow, this is another 6-day war opportunity. They're all there. And then I remembered that not only do we have to consider what the world will say, can you imagine what they would have said? You took advantage of a funeral of people mourning their leader, and that's when you came to attack. And it reminds me of exactly how the Torah describes what Amalek did, which is they came macharecha, you nechashalim baderech, ata ayeti yageh v'lo yarei Elokim. Part of what made them so evil was not just that they attacked us, but how they attacked us. They attacked the infirm, they attacked the children, they attacked the elderly, they attacked the weak. And when we attack, we're going to attack with such confidence. And we're going to attack in strength. I've been giving a lot of thought to everything that's been going on in the news. And Netanyahu keeps on saying, okay, where Americans are still trying to extend Shlab Aleph of this hostage deal, and if this doesn't work, then we're going to go into attack. And I keep thinking, when I'm hearing on all different news reports, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, I'm glad that, so far the Israeli government has been able to keep it secret, but whenever that case may be. And I realized, it's not going to happen during Ramadan. It's not going to happen over the next 3 weeks because we're not cruel, because we're not going to go in when we know that they're fasting for religious purposes. We're not going to be like Shimon and Levi and go in on the third day of the Brit Milah and attack them. We're going to attack. We're going to crush. We're going to crumble them, but out of a state of ethics and morality, because David Hamelech was the last one to finally annihilate Amalek. He had an opportunity to go and to destroy them also with their moments of weakness. And instead, he waited 3 days until an Egyptian who had joined the Amalekite army, until the Egyptian had recuperated and was strong enough to help him see exactly where the hostages had been taken. And we're going to do the same. We are going to go in and show that we are so not like Amalek. We are the antithesis of Hamas. And our victory is not just a military one, it's a moral
one. As the rabbi over here nicely pointed out, as far as being able to view the mitzvah of Amalek either as being halachic or as being something for drasha. There is a third, there's a combination approach, and that is that we recognize that even if halachically we could determine that there is a people or individuals that are Amalekis, we are not at this stage able to just be able to decide on our own. Maybe we need a Sanhedrin to be able, a Melech to be able to decide if that is a practical application to it. So whereas one can take an approach that halachically you can designate certain nations as an Amaleki, but it doesn't make a difference to Lamaisa. Practically speaking, we're not going to act upon it anyway. So this concept of looking at, starting out with the Rabbi mentioned Rav Soloveitchik, but if we take a look at the Netziv, Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, he mentions in the Torah that when Amalek first approaches, he asks questions along the lines like, why Amalek? Why are we so concerned? They're backwater peoples. They haven't, what is our obsession with the Amalek? And he's one of also those who point out, he calls it Tu'udat Amalek, that Amalek really, it's not the nation themselves, because also we're supposed to wipe them out. The Zeicha, the remembrance of Amalek, they're written in our Torah, and the Torah is eternal. We're always going to have a remembrance. But he talks about that anybody who takes upon themselves, Amalek represents the antithesis of the Jewish people. And if it's our job to represent God in this world, as Shani was just talking about the morality of God, if that's our job and that there is divine intervention in this world, Amalek's job is to do their utmost to prove that there is no intervention, there is no God. And that's what they stand for. And therefore the Netziv of Berlin, he says that any nation that takes that to Uda, that's their approach to life, that's their philosophy of life, will receive a din of Amalek. Is that just a drasha, or is that also halachic? So something I think that even when we all are looking at those the television pictures, and in our gut we would like to maybe proceed. We recognize that nowadays we really don't have the ability to do so. It doesn't necessarily detract from a nation receiving a designation as an Amalek people.
Thank you. Gosh. So one thing that Rav Yehuda Cook says when he says you can't call Arabs in general Amalek is that they believe in God, which relates to the point that you made. I guess, first of all, I have the feeling that you described, I have it more often, because every time there's been a hostage exchange, and we've seen those Hamas people lining the streets en masse with their guns. I've wanted to bomb the lot of them. And I have to say that I slightly and hugely respectfully, I'm not sure I'm on the same page as you, because I personally, I don't know, maybe this is wrong, I wouldn't have any problem with bombing the hell out of a group of people that turn out for the funeral of a mass murderer. And yeah, I think I hadn't really thought of it as being such a moral issue. I'd be ready.
This is going to be the JC.
But I know that's right. I'd be a little bit careful. But it does seem to me it kind of goes back to what I said before, which is that we have some very brilliant leaders of our army. We have some very brilliant people in charge of defending us. I think we have to have faith that they know what they're doing and why they're doing it.
Okay. Yes. I think this will be the last question. Yeah.
In the spirit of Abatachim, my question. How do we deal with those? And I think I've heard from each of you, and correct me if I'm wrong, and we're talking about Menachem Mitzvah. And yet there are those in our community who don't. And I'm wondering how we continue with that.
Not in our community.
Who don't what?
They're a different community.
You're talking
Who
about?
don't support IDF, who don't go into IDF,
Ah,
who don't
okay.
view the service
I see.
to the Menachem Mitzvah as something, or Menachem to the Medina as something vital, as we all probably feel in this room. And I'm just curious how we reconcile that pain with Abatachim.
Okay, so the question is about those not serving. That's not speaking euphemistically. The Haredi population, or men, a large majority of the Haredi population, not all of them, who don't serve. So if anyone wants to take that on, and we're not going into politics here, just a sort of that's my hope. We'll see how we go. But as Torah, as educators, as teachers of Torah, how do you respond to that question? Because the questioner spoke very eloquently about how you deal with the pain of this part of our people that is not taking part in this Menachem.
I'll be like a guinea pig.
Go for it.
It'll be like Amalek, you go in first. Pull off the waters.
Pull off the waters, okay. I guess the gut reaction, it's frustrating, right? We all know it's frustrating. And I think most of us in this room probably have either our kids who are in some place. That's usually the opener, right? You meet somebody and say, so where are your kids right now?
How many are in?
How many are in? Right. Is it hot down there? Or are they up in the Hermon, at least being able to look at the snow? And I guess it's like also sometimes we deal with our friends who, as Shani, you were talking about, all of our friends who are still overseas or out there, and we say, but it's like so obvious. Shouldn't you be? I have a close relative who tells me that at least that she is checking always to make sure that her passports are not been they're not expired, right? That they're valid. Thank you. It's like, so a lot of times we have people that we're close to and we appreciate them and our fellow Jews. They don't think exactly like us, and we say to ourselves, Be'ezrat Hashem, they will also continue to grow and to learn, and hopefully they will
see the light.
Yeah. Okay. In this case also it's a little bit harder it hits harder because it hits at home. We know that our kids are out there. Some of us also here have been in service, and with the recognition that but I don't even have to go. We know what the frustrations are, and therefore it's a little bit more challenging. If my relatives don't want to take up the opportunity to be here in the palace of the king, that's their decision. I feel bad for them. But when I feel that somebody's, it's more of a frustration. When I feel that they're now doing theirs in order to protect the Jewish people, it becomes harder to swallow it. I guess I have to teach myself and train myself to take a step backwards and just say, Be'ezrat Hashem, hopefully soon they will also come to understand. And when you do see maybe somewhere that I think that there is a certain maybe closeness amongst part of the community that recognizes that maybe they can't do it because of sociological demands upon them, but maybe they have a greater understanding of what they should be doing, what their responsibilities should be at this point. Just haven't gotten there yet. We hope that they become educated as well and also act upon what I think nowadays they feel deep down inside where they should really be.
Wow. Thank you for hitting a very, very strong point inside. And you're saying this the day after our son, who was in the army for a year and 7 months. He was supposed to get out after a year and 2 months. And literally the day after coming back to his beloved yeshiva, received a text message, "You're all being called back to Miluim now for 70 days. And I know that if there were other boys that could go, then he could stay and continue learning. And we all know, I think we're all educated and we know the arguments when you say Melchemet Mitzvah. So the leaders of the community will explain to you why it's not a Melchemet Mitzvah. When you explain that everyone has to go, they'll explain that there were 3 different populations, 3 different demographics, and not everyone had to go, and there were those who would learn. And when we say yes, but we learn, and we go to the army, again, arguments back and forth, you're right, and it hurts. And I'm glad that you said that it hurts, and I'm so happy that you began with really batachim, because I think very, very often the phenomena and really these tragic and challenging, and I'm going to say historic times that we're living through, and so much of how history is going to unfold is going to be how we respond. And just like you, I realize that we can respond with a lot of anger. We really could. And we can scream and we can protest. And when Haredi cousins are in the room, we can decide not to talk to them. And I think anger does not accomplish anything. It really doesn't. It brings us farther apart. And I heard from, and my rabbi, Rabbi Yosef Tzvi Rimon, once in a different context, an Adam L'Chavero, of basic interaction between man and his fellow man. He said, anytime you feel anger, try to change it into ka'ev, change it into pain, transform anger into pain, whether it's when, that 7th Mishulach knocks on your door, interrupting your family dinner, and you're upset, and wait, but I feel so badly. Obviously, he's coming around at 7:30 at night. That means that he really needs money. And wow, I look at my Haredi nephews and friends, and I'm not angry. I feel a lot of pain. I feel a lot of pain for them, but they're not playing this role in Jewish history. I feel a lot of pain that they're on the side, albeit they're doing a tremendous amount. They're praying and they're learning, and they're giving a tremendous amount of tzedakah, and they're performing thousands of acts of kindness, really so much chesed. But I feel badly for them. They're not on the front lines, and that we're the ones who are really writing that history. And I wish they would join us there. And as Rabbi Felberman said, I think that there are changes going on. Our oldest son is a Rofei Lochim, a doctor lawyer. He's been in the army. I lost count already. He says maybe he's a doctor in Shari Tzedek's emergency room. He said maybe over the past year and a half, he was there maybe 3 weeks, meaning he's really been on the Syrian border, the Gaza border, the Lebanese border. And he was asked over Hanukkah to stay to train the paramedics of the new Hashmonaim Haredi brigade, albeit not so many, but the beginnings of something. And hopefully, that will continue to unfold. I want to end just with a very raw sentiment that I have from this past Shabbat. I went with my husband's Yeshivat HaKotel, to Tel Aviv, and we spent 3 hours on Shabbat in Kikar Chatufim, singing and going around and talking, and it was beautiful. And there were many people who, as soon as they saw, kippot and a kisoy rosh, started screaming, "This is all because of you," and bibiskim, and this, and so you have no idea who I voted for, and different people wanted to start arguing. I said, no, why? They're also, it may be expressing itself in the form of anger. It's really just a lot of pain. And if your son, if your daughter was there, all you would feel is pain. So let's feel more pain for everyone. So if we can feel that pain, then we can cry together. And if we can cry together, then Hashem will see that. And that's what will, as Rav Hashem, catalyze the next stage of redemption.
Gosh, I can't think of myself as a nice person and a moderate. I find myself once again in the extreme position. And I listen to the two of you, and it's humbling because you speak so beautifully. But I think perhaps there is a bit of room. And I take on board everything you both say, and it's beautiful. But maybe there's also some room for some righteous anger, and particularly directed at, you didn't want us to talk politics, but I think our political leadership have to have some backbone. And I think there's also a thing called taking a moral stance and taking a stand against things that are very, very, very clearly unfair. And I would like to see my political leaders standing up for what I think is a very, very clear moral position, which is that fundamentally everyone has to defend this land, and it shouldn't just fall upon a few people, and it certainly shouldn't be that some people just get a free ride, because it's just brutally unfair, and it's brutally unfair on families who have to be mourning their kids who've fallen in battle, on families whose kids who've been away for so long at war. And I think that forgiveness is an incredibly important part of our tradition. Perhaps I haven't been as strong on that, but I think also taking a strong moral stance is also part of our tradition that we can't put aside. So now you've left me a bit confused on that.
Okay. I want to thank you all very much. I should say, so I have 3 young children who are nowhere near army age yet. But every year I remind them that on Purim, as well as all the fun stuff and the mitzvah of Menachem Begin and the mitzvah, but the tachbosot, the dressing up, and all this, there is also the mitzvah of hearing the Megillah. And I think that, you know, the famous amusing saying of how a Jewish holiday is, they try to kill us, they fail, let's eat. It turns out they're trying to kill us, let's eat, but also let's learn, let's study, let's think about our tradition, let's think about the Torah, let's think about our history and what the great rabbis of the past and our contemporary educators have to teach us. So it's a real pleasure to be able to bring you here. Rabbi Baruch Felberman, Rabbi Gideon, Sylvester, Shani, Taragin, thank you so much. Big round of applause. I'm number 41 in front of the mayor. In just under 2 weeks, 23rd of March, we have Benny Begin speaking about the Camp David Accords here. So you can just show up or register online on our website or Facebook page, or email me, paulg@begincenter.org.il. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you all who watched on Zoom. Bye bye.